Thanks so much, everyone. This is truly impressive. Gathered here at Princeton University to discuss Hasidism, and the fact that we made that migration and counter-migration really astonishing, actually. So what I'd like to do in the 20, 25 minutes or so that I have is to do more of like to intertwine the spiritual and social history of Hasidism, because I really think they're inextricable, and that'll be a lot more helpful. So just to start out, I'd like to mention a few superlatives. First off, this could be a little controversial, but first off, I consider Hasidism to be the most important spiritual revolution in Judaism since Kabbalah of the Middle Ages. That's just my perspective on this. Secondly, and this is a little more factual, Hasidism emerges in the 18th century in Eastern Europe, where the majority of the world's Jews resided. About 3/4 of the world's Jewish population by the 19th century resided in these areas that Hasidism emerges. And the third thing to emphasize is that among American Jews, those who descended from East European Jews or from Eastern Europe reach around 85%. And according to AI, even higher. What that's worth. So that's just to emphasize the importance of this subject, just for understanding Jewish history. I would also like to push back against certain what I consider historiographical trends, perhaps misconceptions, beginning with the idea that Hasidism emerged as a reaction to some sort of a crisis, whether it was a socioeconomic crisis, supposedly creating a more egalitarian spiritual movement. I mean, it is in certain ways more egalitarian, but I don't think that's a sufficient explanation for its rise, or as a reaction to violence. It turns out, according to historians like Gershon Hundert and Moshe Rossman, that Jewish life in Eastern Europe around the time that Hasidism arises, in the 1740s, 50s, 60s, and so on, Jewish life was relatively stable and relatively prosperous. So that's just one thing I want to put out there. Another thing I want to address more recently is a claim that on the eve of the Holocaust, East European Jews, Polish Jews in particular, were despondent and feeling doomed, and many predicted this thing was about to happen, but were helpless to do anything about. Those who could get out were clamoring to get out or did get out. I disagree based on my reading of Hasidic and Orthodox communities in Poland who really saw things very differently. They saw Poland as kind of the heartland of Hasidism. Their Rebbe tended to live there, the Hasidic court. It was a richer spiritual experience, and therefore, even if your body was in danger, your spirit was in danger if you went to America or Mandate Palestine or wherever. So that's a very important thing to think about is for Hasidic Jews at least, there's not the sense of urgency or impending doom, and perhaps unfortunately, but this is very much the case. Finally, and really, I would say most importantly of all, what is modernity? Jewish historians, including of Eastern Europe, have tended to emphasize secularism, Zionism, socialism, communism, Polonization, and so on, as defining modernity. But you can't do that when you look at these enormous Hasidic and Orthodox communities. I would estimate still around half the Jews of Eastern Europe were either intensely or loosely affiliated with these more traditionalist movements. Modernity should really be rethought as a kind of encounter, an encounter between these forces of secularism and traditionalism. I think that's even true of American Jewry today, I would say. So those are a few perhaps provocative things to think about as we talk about Hasidism, which I would define as a mass mystical movement that centered around charismatic figures known as Rebbes in Yiddish or tzaddikim in Hebrew. Now, to begin, we have really two trajectories, and I use the available portraits of very key figures. One trajectory is Moses Mendelssohn, a trajectory towards Haskalah, which Professor Olga Litvak has complicated a great deal. But just to give a sense of the direction of things, there are many Jews in Europe and in Eastern Europe who will trend towards Haskalah, and then secularist movements like Zionism and socialism and so on, these forms of Zionism. And Mendelssohn is a very influential figure. We're going to focus on the other direction, which I have here a portrait of the Alter Rebbe, of Chabad, or Lubavitcher Hasidism. That direction is towards traditionalism, and that's what we're focusing on today. There are three major underpinnings or precursors to Hasidism. The first I would emphasize is practical Kabbalah and Balei Shem, or name masters, masters of the divine name, became very influential in Eastern Europe. If Eastern Europe is not really known for innovating Kabbalistic ideas to the same extent as other centers, it's definitely innovating practical Kabbalah. It pervades every corner of Jewish life throughout the 18th century. So very important to the rise of Hasidism. In fact, the purported founder of Hasidism, Rabbi Israel, the Baal Shem Tov, is one of these practitioners of Kabbalah. Number two, Sabbatianism. Followers of Shabtai Tzvi. We don't know how many there are in Eastern Europe because they tend to be underground, but it does burst out in the open right before or during the rise of Hasidism in the form of Frankism, followers of Jacob Frank, who claim to be the reincarnation. We have this messianism that's going to be very important to the rise of Hasidism as well, even if, as Gershom Scholem has emphasized, it becomes somewhat muted under Hasidism. And then finally, the figure of the Hasid, who really emerges in medieval German-speaking lands, an ascetic Hasid who's elitist, a practitioner and student of Kabbalah, who really is going to be important in conceptualizing Hasidism, but almost as a foil, because the new style Hasidism is going to turn this asceticism, if you know what I mean by asceticism, it's fasting and self-torment and so on for religious purposes. Hasidism is going to come along and turn that whole idea on its head and claim that to be a Hasid actually is to engage in the material world and transform it. So how do we get here from those three precursors? Well, it all begins in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which by the time of Hasidism's rise and emergence as a mass movement has been or is being partitioned by its neighbors, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Poland is going to be virtually wiped off the map. It will reemerge as a much smaller Duchy of Warsaw and then Kingdom of Poland, but that too is going to be really absorbed into the Tsarist Empire. So to all extents and purposes, Poland is no more, excuse me, Polish patriots, but this is sort of what's happening in the political scene. But more importantly, I think to the rise of Hasidism is what I emphasized before, and that is the sense of stability, safety, and numbers, an enormous demographic advantage. Jews in these lands may only be around 10%, which is a lot more than the United States, but they're clustering in the towns and cities, and they can be 70, 80, 90% of urban population, especially large towns. In actual cities, it's smaller. It's more like a third, but still a very potent population. Why does this say and emerge that Poland is heaven for the nobles, paradise for the Jews, purgatory for the townspeople, and hell for the serfs? This has a lot to do with the feudalistic system or the remnants of feudalism in which Jews had actually carved out an advantageous position. They are protected by the nobility physically, but also given economic possibilities unavailable in many other parts of Europe as leaseholders, especially of taverns and distilleries, but also mills and ponds and tolls and other non-agricultural enterprises. And that provides a great deal of economic security and sometimes real prosperity. Add to that, Jews are favored also as merchants, locally, regionally, internationally, bringing in luxury items from far-flung parts of Europe and the Ottoman Empire. And they're valued and also taxed as merchants. And this all adds to the sense that Jews are needed, that Jews are perhaps indispensable. And the tavern keeper, as I wrote in one of my books, is much more than a tavern keeper. The Jewish tavern keeper who leases the local tavern from the nobleman who owns the taverns and owns all the land around, that Jewish tavern keeper is also a storekeeper, a source of news, entertainment, and medical remedies and advice and all kinds of other functions. So Jews are really a key feature of this area. And when the Baal Shem Tov emerges, he emerges within this atmosphere of relative security and prosperity. We know that he exists because Moshe Rossman found him on a tax list, and lo and behold, he was actually exhibiting a favored tax status. He was tax exempt. He was sort of like a Baal Shem in residence, and he was very much ensconced in the elite, which pushes against this idea of Hasidism as some sort of a social revolt. We also have a letter of the Baal Shem Tov that scholars have argued over, which has basic kind of programmatic claims. The Baal Shem Tov experiences an ascent of the soul in which he meets the Messiah, and he's told, he should spread his teachings throughout the world. And maybe Chabad houses have fulfilled this to some great extent on college campuses. And there are other aspects of this letter too that are very important. But I want to emphasize a different letter, because in this letter to one of his main disciples, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polanoia, he writes, "I received your letter at the conclusion of the Sabbath and saw that in the first 2 lines you said you must fast. I'm deeply upset at your words, and let me add that you should not place yourself in this danger. This is the way of melancholy and sadness, and the divine presence, or Shekhinah, does not inspire through sadness, but only through the joy of performing commandments." In this couple of lines, he's really transforming what it means to be a Hasid. A Hasid is not somebody who avoids the material world, who avoids food, drink, and joy, but rather somebody who embraces and perhaps transforms materialism into something positive. And that's going to be the genius move of the Baal Shem Tov and other founders of Hasidism. And so you actually are encouraged to dance. Dancing was perhaps associated with the peasantry, something uncouth. No, dance can be a form of worship. According to Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, when one drinks wine, also drinking's okay too, on the Sabbath or holidays, at a wedding or other holy feasts, and does so moderately and for the sake of heaven, to rejoice in Israel and God, and thereby arouses such joy that it penetrates down to his feet, i.e. that he dances out of joy, to expel all evil which clings to the feet. They sweeten and nullify evil decrees. This is a sense that God sort of decrees punishments on the Jewish people for their sins, and this is going to nullify those decrees, and one becomes worthy of all blessings. Dancing can be a vehicle for worship, for connection. It also explains this idea of cleaving to God. How do you cleave God? Not through avoiding, song, drink, dance, but actually doing it so you can achieve the state of connection to the divine When an individual studies or prays in awe and love, adhering to and binding his thoughts to the Creator, pondering that the entire earth is filled with his glory. Now, this is from Isaiah, but it becomes now central as a key text or a proof text for the Hasidic way, that if the world is permeated with the divine presence, then, and there's no place free of him, then everything is filled with the vital energy of the Creator. And it follows that everything which he sees is nothing but the vital energy of the Creator drawn into that thing. So when you learn this way of seeing, you can actually achieve a state of connection in no matter what you're doing. We perceive our world as material and coarse only because we chase after empty goals and physical desires. However, if we're discerning and adhere to the pleasantness and sweetness of the light of God and the constant performance of his commandments, this world is proven to be good and valuable. For then in every place, one sees nothing but the sweetness and pleasantness of the vital energy of the Creator. Again, it's a way of seeing, of experiencing the divine in everything. And there is no independent evil or demonic realm. It's all just sort of a cover for divinity if you know how to find it. This leaves this notion of the tzaddik or Rebbe who can perform miracles. And just to summarize for the sake of time, the Rebbe is somebody who's perfected this technique and can connect himself to God in such a way that he too becomes almost like a part of God and can perform miracles. This is from Noam Elimelech. And this is going to lead to a whole literature, of Hasidic tales, first oral and then written down, printed, of various miracle feats that these Hasidic leaders are able to achieve. But it's also important for an everyday person to try to attain that sensibility as well. When a merchant travels on business, he should say to himself, I'm traveling for business so that I will have the money to serve God by paying for my son's tuition, yeshiva tuition, so that my sons will be scholars engaging in Torah and mitzvot for the sake of heaven, and so that I can marry my daughters to scholars who sanctify the Sabbath and give charity. Okay, it's a little bit patriarchal, but still, the idea is even in there's no better business bureau in these days. The marketplace can be a very, very tough and kind of deceitful place. Even in the act of doing business, if you have in mind your goal is to support piety, then you've connected your business to God. And Hasidism is going to spread like wildfire. You can't really probably see any of these towns on this map. It's going to go in all directions of Eastern Europe. At the very top corner there, you'll see Lubavitch, which is where Chabad Hasidism derives. I'm not trying to pander here, but I think it's a good focus. And the only place it doesn't really dominate is in parts of Lithuania where the Vilna Gaon, as he's known, holds sway. And he manages an anti-Hasidic or non-Hasidic movement, which actually is still quite mystical and based on Kabbalah, but very much against its spread and its popularization. And that comes to be the core of the yeshiva movement that we're going to see later on. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. Other than that area around Vilna or Vilnius, you're going to see Hasidic courts emerging everywhere, where pilgrims will travel for blessings and for business advice and for healing and other kinds of miracles all over Eastern Europe. Some of these Hasidic movements or dynasties, as they become, are much more intellectual and cerebral, and Chabad is a great example of this. In fact, Chabad is going to create the first Hasidic yeshiva. Others are going to become much more, I would say, colorful, royalistic, and celebratory and emotional. Places where you actually embrace the material in ways that some consider perhaps controversial. But it is heartening, it is sort of, I would say, encouraging to Jews in Eastern Europe throughout the 19th century, which is going to descend into a much more dangerous and inhospitable kind of atmosphere, to know that that Jews have a kind of a king too, or a kind of a noble too, right? And that is the Rebbe, who lives in this palace. And they really do, in certain dynasties, start purchasing the palaces of declining nobility and have all the trappings of royalty. And this is another direction that Hasidism goes. So the 19th century is really defined by these courts and by these miracles and okay. And I do want to mention Hasidic women being very much part of this story, despite, for some reason, the best efforts of historians of Hasidism to deny them a Hasidic identity. Women are very much Hasidic and part of this Hasidic movement, but much more behind the scenes, I would say. When things get dangerous with the first pogroms, these mass really deadly mass violence incidents, collective violence against the Jewish communities. This is just in the Pale settlement that is happening. You know, Hasidism is not going to disappear. It's going to thrive on a certain optimism. To give you one example, the Svat Emet. On the verse, the enemy said, this is right after the first pogrom wave, or during the first pogrom wave, really. The enemy said, I shall pursue, overtake them, divide the spoils, consume them, put them to the sword, destroy them by my hand. For this too they offered praise. This is after the parting of the Red Sea. The Israelites offered praise despite all the violence, for they saw that it all led to the greater glorification of God. In other words, it seemed horrible while we were slaves, but God always has a purpose, a redemptive purpose. We need to know the same thing in this present exile, as it is written, as in the days when you came out of Egypt, I will show you wonders. Things will get better. Didn't really get that much better. The Soviet Union did put an end to most collective anti-Jewish violence, but it also meant anti-religious campaigns. Hasidism is driven underground. Chabad and to some extent Bratslaver Hasidism does allow it to survive in an underground manner. But Hasidism is really going to do much better in Poland, where despite forms of discrimination, traditionalism, traditional Judaism is allowed to flourish institutionally. In the Second Republic of Poland, if you look at the arrows, yeshivas, sometimes entire yeshivas are migrating over into Poland. It becomes sort of like a reservoir for yeshivas. And Hasidic yeshivas, many are created for the first time here, but Chabad yeshivas, Tomchei Tmimim, are just simply established here as part of the network. And you can get a sense of the numbers here. These are based on my own accountings. Schools for women, for Hasidic and Orthodox women are emerging in Poland as well. So it's a real shift from the Hasidic courts to a much more kind of educational attitude. Torah study should be the main emphasis rather than the miracles and the courts and so on. And this is what I argue in my most recent book. Even artists depicting the Hasidic communities, will often show Hasidim studying rather than dancing, which is kind of an interesting iconographic shift. There's also political parties that are founded or sponsored by Ger Hasidism, and they often act, though, more as sponsors for traditional education. They have members of parliament of the same. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe eventually comes over and settles into Poland himself. This is just a visit. 2 years later, though, he's going to permanently establish his, Chabad headquarters in Poland, first in Warsaw and then in Otwock. However, anti-Semitism is very much on the rise. This idea of Jewish power, exaggerated notions of Jewish power, domination, control. And in Poland, there's a real effort to drive Jews out of the economy and drive Jews out of Poland. I just want to point out, they always pick Hasidic Jew when they want to depict a Jew. So this kind of represents all Jews in the eyes of, anti-Semites, okay, but still, and look how racialized it is as well. Why is this not a problem? Why are Hasidic Jews still staying? There's this idea that, yes, there's bodily exile, but there's something more dangerous, which is spiritual exile, assimilation. That's happening too in Poland, but it's much worse in America. and other Western European countries. So your soul is safer here, even if your body is in peril. And how do you respond to a pogrom? You establish a new yeshiva in the area where the pogrom occurred. It's like almost like a spiritual war despite all this physical danger. So when we get to the Holocaust, Hasidic Jews are very much targeted. They visibly meet all the definitions of what a Jew should look like, based on the propaganda posters in Germany. And so, it's actually, I found out who this person is because often you'll see this picture and nobody was curious about who he was. He was actually a assistant rabbi of the town of Olkush, and here he is being humiliated, tormented, and probably murdered right after. Chabad turns out to be the most successful in getting its students out because the Lubavitcher Rebbe escapes, ironically with the help of a Nazi. It's an incredible story. Escapes, comes to America, and starts getting out especially yeshiva students, but also provides Eleanor Roosevelt and the US government with a list of over 250 Hasidic and non-Hasidic rabbis and their families in the Warsaw Ghetto whom he would like to see rescued. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen. What really happens in Warsaw and other ghettos is a fair number of Hasidic and other Orthodox Jews, they don't go into hiding, they don't shave their beard, they actually go underground. They don't even register to work. They go underground, people will bring them food, and they just study Torah. And for them, this is the ultimate resistance. And so I'm going to conclude, which I think is really maybe not an effective form of resistance, but somehow more inspiring even than things like physical resistance, is they studied throughout until the bitter end. And it was a way of transcending this horrible situation and really staying true to the Hasidic ideals, that evil has no autonomy, that the divine permeates everything. In one speech, and this I'll conclude with, by Menachem Zhemba on Hanukkah 1942, to the students in one of these yeshiva bunkers, he tells them, "You are like the flask of oil discovered in the ancient temple, which, because of its purity, was able to light the whole world." Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Glenn. That was really I don't even have the words to describe a run through Hasidic history in 25 minutes, a real accomplishment, and it really sets the scene and gives me a frame to begin describing some of the key ideas of Chabad Hasidism, which we heard a little bit about already from Glenn, and some of the ideas that I'm going to talk about in more detail we also heard about from Glenn, and hopefully here we can dig a little bit more deeply into some key texts and see how they illustrate not only the geographic, political, historical context of Hasidism, but also the intellectual context of Hasidism, thinking in terms of the broader trajectories of Jewish thought that predated Hasidism, and which Hasidism is continuing, is in dialogue with, and is reshaping in new ways. Okay, so the first text is a text that was again already mentioned very briefly, the Baal Shem Tov's letter to his brother-in-law, Reb Gershon of Kuti, which was published in 1781 in the book Ben Porat Yosef by Reb Yaakov Yosef Ponoya. And I'm not going to read the whole, this is excerpts, and I'm not going to read all of the excerpts. I just want to highlight a couple of things. The most famous thing about this letter is that the Baal Shem Tov ascends, his soul ascends on high, he meets the Messiah, and the Messiah says, in response to the question, "When will you come, sir?" the Messiah answers, "By this sign you will know, when your teaching becomes famous and revealed in the world, and your well springs which I taught you and you grasped will be disseminated outside, and they too will be able to practice unifications and ascents like you." So the Messiah will come when everyone is like the Baal Shem Tov. That's the most famous part, but then there's a post-text, there's a postscript. There's also a whole section that comes before that, and there's one thing which I didn't put on here, which I want to mention, which is that when the Baal Shem Tov ascends on high, before he has this exchange with the Messiah, he perceives that in heaven there's tremendous joy, there's tremendous excitement. And he thinks to himself, perhaps the reason why they're all so happy is because I've died and I've come to join them. And they tell him, no, that's not the case. The reason why we are so overjoyed is because we take pleasure in the worship that you do down there in the world. The joy that we have on high comes from your activity in the world. Don't worry, you haven't died. So I'm saying this because we're going to come, this actually has a lot to do with ideas that are going to later be much more fully developed in a much more intellectually and theoretically worked out way. The idea of Dir B'Tachtonim, the idea that God's dwelling place and the place where God's ultimate pleasure will be achieved is in this physical world. But now I want to come to what happens after the Messiah tells the Baal Shem Tov that the key to the perfection of the world, the key to the messianic future is in the dissemination of his teachings. The Baal Shem Tov says that he was very pained. So this is in the third paragraph that you see on the screen. I was much pained over the immense length of time that it would take for this to be accomplished. However, while I was there, I learned 3 things and 3 divine names, and I thought that perhaps thereby also people of my age, my era, could come to a station and plane like mine. And they did not give me permission to reveal them all the days of my life. I am sworn to stand by this. So something was revealed to him which he thought would enable other people to achieve what he had achieved, but he's not able to reveal what those things are. So we're back to square one. Yet, he continues, the following I make known to you, and God shall be in your aid. So now we have a teaching, an actual substantive idea that you can put into practice yourself. Anyone who reads this can do that. Try this at home. While you pray and study, and in every single word and utterance of your lips, have intent to unify the name of God, for in every single letter there are worlds and souls and divinity, and they ascend, bond, and unite with one another, uniting in true singularity with divinity, and you shall encompass your soul together with them, and all the worlds unite as one and ascend, making great joy and pleasure without measure. Okay, so let's home in on this teaching. We have worlds, souls, and divinity, which are in everything. And they come together, so we have cosmos, worlds, we have souls, that's the individual, the human being, and divinity, God. And language, speech, intentional speech, is the medium of union between these 3 elements of reality. So principle number 1, language is the medium of union. Principle number 2, worlds, souls, and divinity are the principal building blocks of reality. And principle number 3 is that even though humans are finite, and you might think that a word spoken is very ephemeral and doesn't really carry much weight or make much impact, yet the intentional communication that a human articulates can encompass and unite all of reality in transcendent and immeasurable joy. So this letter is a very important letter because, in addition, it tells us a lot about the Baal Shem Tov, his self-perception. Historians, as Glenn mentioned, historians have written many books, all flowing out, analyzing this letter, and there's a huge amount that can be extrapolated from it. But I'm homing in on these 3 elements, world, souls, and divinity, because I think they become especially important in Chabad thought. Okay, text number 2. And this comes from the Tanya, published in 1796. 30 years after the Baal Shem Tov's ascent on high, we have the foundational work of Chabad thought, the Tanya. And I'm just going to home in on one little passage from the second chapter. The context here is he's describing how the soul is one with the very soul, with the very self of God. The soul is one with the very self of God, by dint of being rooted in divine wisdom and divine thought and divine wisdom, which in Kabbalistic terms is Chachmato Shal HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the wisdom of God. It's one of the 10 Sefirot, the first of the 10 Sefirot, depending on how you count. So this is a dimension of divine being, and the soul is rooted in the wisdom of God. And the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, makes his point by taking two earlier texts, and splicing them together. So I want to talk about each text individually in its original context, its meaning, its significance in its original context. And then the new idea a third idea really, that the Alter Rebbe is articulating using the combination of these two texts. So the first text is from Tikkun Zohar. God is wise, but not with known wisdom. Now, the original significance of this statement is that although we refer to the 10 Sefirot, the 10 divine faculties, using terminology borrowed from human experience, from the human psyche, we say that God is wise, we say that God is kind, and so on. However, we should not think that when we refer to divine wisdom, we're referring to anything that's comparable to our experience of wisdom. It's something utterly different. And so the meaning of this statement, he is wise but not with known wisdom, is a statement of esoteric principle. You can't really know what the faculties of God are. It's a statement of negative theology. Even though we're using a set of terms to describe God, we have to also underscore that God cannot actually be defined by these terms. And as some philosophers or theologians will say, when we say that God is wise, we're really saying that he's not wise. We're not actually ascribing something positive to him. We're saying that he doesn't lack wisdom, as opposed to defining him as wise. So that's the original meaning of the Tikkun Zohar. Then we have another statement, which comes from Maimonides, which actually the Alter Rebbe specifically cites Maimonides here. He doesn't cite the Tikkun Zohar. He doesn't say this is from the Zohar, but we know it's from the Zohar, Tikkun Zohar. Whereas with the next piece of his formulation, he says, Kamosha Kasev HaRambam, as the Rambam writes, as Maimonides writes, Hu Hamad V'Hu Yedea, God is the knowledge, and God is that which is known. Now, the context of this is that the Rambam, Maimonides, wants to emphasize the oneness of God, the simplicity of God, the idea that God is not subject to any differentiation. God is totally unlike the world that we experience, where if we look around this room, there's a great multiplicity of things. God is a pure, simple being with no different facets, God doesn't have a head or an arm. God doesn't have dimension. God is a pure singularity. And so when we talk of divine knowledge, Maimonides emphasizes, we cannot think of divine knowledge as being like our experience of knowledge, where we have a self which knows, there's the individual who is the knower, there is the thing that is known, a second thing, and there is the third thing, the knowledge that connects the knower to the known. So these are three different things. I know that there is a chair over here, but I am not the chair. Whereas in the case of God, God's knowledge is self-knowledge. This is really an Aristotelian idea. God is thought thinking itself. Okay? So this is not a statement about, neither of these statements, neither the statement of the Zohar nor the statement of Maimonides is a statement about God's union with other things. The statement of the Zohar is a statement about how God is beyond any form of knowledge that we could have, and we don't know what God is. The statement of Maimonides is a statement about the self-enclosed singularity of God. Neither of these are statements about God's relationship with the world or with people, but Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi splices them together into a statement about God's union with human beings. God is wise, but not with known wisdom. Rather, he and his wisdom are one, as the Rambam writes that he is the knowledge and the knower. So his point over here is that God's wisdom is one with God's self, and therefore the soul is also one with God. Which that last element, the soul being one with God, is not something that either the Tikkun Zohar or Maimonides were especially interested in emphasizing, but that is his point. That is Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi's point here. Now, there's a gloss inserted in the Tanya to this statement, to the quote of the Rambam, which shows us that Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi knows very well what he's doing. He knows that he's splicing together two traditions that are really at odds with one another. In fact, the whole doctrine of the Sphirot, the idea that there are 10 characteristics or faculties of the divine, it's totally contradictory, really, to the Maimonidean principle of God's singularity, that God has no facets, that God is a pure, simple essence. And Rabbi Shneur Zalman Liadi knows this very well, and he addresses it in his footnote. He says, even though the Kabbalists declare that there are 10 facets of God, and there are 3 intellectual facets, Chochmah, Bina, and Das, or you could say Kesser, Chochmah, and Bina. Nevertheless, the Kabbalists agree with Maimonides, as is written in the Pardes. Now, he's referring to a specific passage in the Ramak, where Ramak actually wants to show that the Kabbalistic model of the Sphirot is compatible with Maimonides, and he says the first 3 Sphirot, Keser, Chochmah, and Bina, are the knower, God's self. The knower is Keser, and Bina is the thing that is known, and Chochmah is the knowledge that connects the knower to the thing that is known. So Ramak reads Ramak reads the Kabbalistic concept of God into Maimonides, or Maimonides into the Kabbalistic God. So there's already a synthesis that's happening in earlier Kabbalah, which the Alter Rebbe is aware of and he points to. But then he says, when we get to Lurianic Kabbalah, which is, we're now talking in the 16th century. Ramak is also a 16th century figure, but he precedes the great revolution of Kabbalah inaugurated by Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, the Arizal. The Arizal, his Kabbalistic model emphasizes a massive rupture between the infinitude of God, the transcendence of God, and God as manifest within the world, including within the realm of Atzilut, where we have the 10 Sphirot. So to speak of God having 10 attributes is highly problematic for the Arizal. It's more problematic for the Arizal than it is for the earlier Kabbalists, because for the Arizal, there's an infinite gap between the transcendence of God and the particular mode of divine revelation that we call the 10 Sphirot. Okay, so I don't want to get too stuck into this. I'm only bringing this out to show how here we have an example of the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman Liadi, the founder of Chabad, taking a concept that we find in the letter of the Baal Shem Tov, the idea of the soul as the idea of the individual as a site of union with God, a site of cosmic union. And what the Alter Rebbe is doing here is he's putting that into the larger context of Jewish thought, going all the way back to Maimonides and the Zohar, and is showing how these things can be held together, how they can be synthesized, and is addressing them in a rigorous way, in a thought-out way. He's pointing to the problems and addressing the problems. We don't have time to do proper justice to how he is addressing these problems and how he's theorizing the way in which, even according to the Lurianic Kabbalah, this statement that the soul is one with God because it is rooted in the thought of God, how that can be upheld even according to Lurianic Kabbalah, we're going to move on, okay? Hold the question. Take the question home and think about it. Okay. So now, before wrapping up, I want to just home in on three conceptual shifts. One concerning God, another concerning the cosmos, and a third concerning humanity, which come out, which are more or less from the text that we've seen and from other texts. First is the idea that the oneness of God encompasses all being. God is at once utterly removed from the cosmos. That's emphasized especially by the Lurianic rupture between God and the cosmos, and also utterly one with the cosmos, which is achieved, one of the ways that that's achieved at least, is through Atzilus. Atzilus is a kind of bridge. The 10 Sefirot are a kind of bridge through which God enters into union with the cosmos, and we saw some of that in that previous source. Second of all, this oneness is revealed when humanity used language to intentionally communicate, increasingly bringing this oneness to the fore of consciousness. So a huge emphasis of Chabad thought is to bring the idea that God is the only real thing that exists, and that all things are somehow manifestations of the divine, to bring that to the fore of consciousness. Number two, this world is the locus of God's ultimate purpose, Dira b'tachtonim. So this is an idea which we saw already in the letter of the Baal Shem Tov. It's implied in the great joy that they have from his activities in the lower realms. They're happy not because he's died and his soul is ascended on high. They're happy because of the activities that he does joyously down below. It's also hinted at in the idea that the Messiah will come when your wellsprings are disseminated outside. In other words, the highest ideal is not to be achieved in some kind of elite situation amongst a group of ascetic mystics, but rather it's something that is to be achieved in the world at large. And this is something that's really emphasized in Tanya chapter 36. And it becomes the starting point for the opus of Rashab, the fifth Rebbe of Chabad, in his opus Samach Vav. Now, I mention the Rebbe Rashab because, as was mentioned by Rabbi Bentzi earlier, in the spring of this past year, the Institute of Hasidic Thought here at Princeton convened a group of graduate students to study some of the Rashab's teachings and to translate them. And I believe that later in the day we're going to hear more about Rashab and his teachings in particular. So just a couple of words about Rashab. He is the Rebbe at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. He passed away in Rostov on the Don in 1920, shortly after the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, have established control over much of the territory that had previously been the Russian Empire. And in a sense, he brings Chabad, one era of Chabad, to a close, but also, very importantly, sets the scene for the new era of Chabad, which we're still living in, I would say, today, which is that there's the era of the 19th century, which, as Glenn has formulated it, the Hasidic model of leadership and community, or the Hasidic institution, was centered on the court of the Rebbe. And the Rashab inaugurates the shift to the new model of the yeshiva as a central institution by which, a place of study, a place where students are educated, and study, he has a vision not only for a Hasidic yeshiva where Hasidim study Talmud, but a Hasidic yeshiva where in addition to studying Talmud and in addition to studying Jewish law, students will study Hasidic thought in a very rigorous way. And within that context, he also creates an intellectual revolution whose fullest statement is found in his opus, Samach Vav, a series of 60 discourses, 61 discourses, depending how you count, delivered beginning on Rosh Hashanah 1905 and extending into the winter of 1907, 1908. So these discourses are delivered over about 2.5 years, with some breaks, some pauses. And we're going to, in a moment, look at a few excerpts from the opening discourse, which I think is a really important, it really sets the scene, and it's a kind of mission statement, an intellectual mission statement for what he wants Chabad thought to become. Okay, but before we get there, we've said something about the oneness of God, we've said something about the world as the locus of God's ultimate purpose, and I want to say one more thing about the soul as a central conduit of divine revelation. That's the third point over here. Mivsari Echz Elokah. This is a principle articulated already in the early generations of Hasidism, emphasized in the early generations of Chabad, that we come to know God through knowing ourselves. This is actually a quote from a biblical verse. From my flesh I see God, and the Chabad masters, as well as other Hasidic masters, interpret this to mean not from my physical flesh, but from the soul that is within my flesh, from myself, from my own psyche. And as we have already seen in Tanya chapter 2, the soul is described as a manifestation of divine wisdom, which is one with the divine self. And this principle, this idea that the soul itself is divine, becomes, especially for Rashab, becomes a kind of explanation of how the soul is, being a microcosm, being a piece of God, can become a window, a paradigm through which we can come to know God. So through a kind of phenomenological exploration of the self, of one's own psychology, in a very rigorous way, rooted very much in a tradition of learning, very much rooted in a kind of mapping of the spiritual cosmos as it's found in earlier Kabbalistic texts, but still a deeply personal effort, which we see exhibited very much in Rashab's own teachings. We see it's almost like he's telling you his own spiritual experience, his own psychological experiences, not just spiritual experiences, but also kind of different attitudes to worship, different forms of relationship to God, also intellectual processes, emotional processes, a very phenomenological exploration of psychological phenomena. He uses all of that to emphasize that human experience, agency, and I would add, creativity, however constrained, however abject the human experience might be, is nevertheless the only source through which God's essential messianic radiance can ultimately be disclosed. And I emphasize here essential and messianic. In other words, the kind of experience that we can, and the kind of revelation of God that we can come to through our own selves is not just some kind of accommodation, something less than ideal. It is the greatest ideal for which God created the whole cosmos to begin with. Okay, and let's just read, to conclude, I'm going to read this and not analyze it, and just leave it for you as a kind of impression, which I believe that this is what I have here is some excerpts from the opening discourse of Samach Vav, and I think that this will give a good sense of the intellectual mission statement, as it were, of the fifth Rebbe of Chabad, the Rebbe Rashab. The creation of the world is via the primordial symptom, which is a kind of rupture or withdrawal or concealment that occurred in the infinite light, and a hollow and empty space was left. And the totality of the cosmos is within the hollow and empty space that remained after the symptom. Yet, it is written, he placed them in the Garden of Eden to work it and safeguard it, referring to the work of the 248 positive commandments and safeguarding against the 365 negative commandments in order to draw forth additional radiance from the infinite light that precedes the symptom to the point that in the Messianic future, the infinite revelation will be revealed in the hollow as it was prior to the Simsum. Seemingly, however, Rashab asks, it is difficult to understand what innovation is achieved by this. Is it not the case that prior to the Simsum, the infinite light already filled the hollow space entirely? So what's the point of creating a cleared empty space where there's no divine revelation, and then creating this whole constellation of worlds, and then human beings who have to undergo this whole process of then revealing and drawing back additional radiance into the hollow and making the infinite light manifest all over again? If it wasn't broken, why fix it? The simple explanation, we'll leave that aside, we'll leave the simple explanation aside. I want to highlight the additional explanation. We can further explain, because this is really his starting point. He's starting with this new explanation, this further explanation, is that a superlative light will be revealed which transcends the primordial light. This is the additional radiance that flows forth by Torah and mitzvot, that the interiority and essence of the infinite light shall shine, which transcends even the light that initially filled the place of the hollow. So what we're going to achieve, what humanity are going to achieve through their work in the world, is not going to just be a return to the original perfection, but it's going to be a greater, more essential revelation of God, a new revelation of God. As stated at the beginning of the Decalogue, I am Hashem, your God. That is, I am who I am. That is the essence of the infinite light that transcends the whole chain of being, which yet flows forth therefrom to be Hashem, your God, meaning a new revelatory name. Okay, so what he's saying here is that the opening statement of the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue, is that through the Torah and through the mitzvah, the Jewish people are going to create a new form of divine revelation, a new revelatory name, which is called your God, because it is made by you via Torah and mitzvot. And for the 100 years that we skipped, you can take a look at my recent book, Kabbalah and the Rapture of Modernity. I just say that Glenn's most recent book, also on the light of learning, is also a fabulous and fascinating picture of Hasidism in the period after Rashab. So there's a lot more to say, and I guess if there's time, we'll take questions.
Professor Dynner, you had mentioned early in your talk that the socioeconomic setting in which Hasidism rose was, you sort of underplayed that. It is my understanding the narrative says that the Baal Shem Tov chose to reach out to the uneducated, simple Pashta Jews who lived in rural areas in Eastern Europe, as opposed to the rather well-to-do intellectual Jews in other parts of Europe who had the economic resources to pay for a Malamed, to sit and learn, to study, who didn't need to struggle day to day to earn a living. Can you reconcile those two narratives, those two views?
Sure. Yeah, that's definitely the story that we tell ourselves, and unfortunately historians rain on everybody's parade, because they go into the archives and they find sources that contradict that. The tax list was a good indication of the Baal Shem Tov hanging out with the wrong people, and trying not to think of Mamdani right now. But yeah, basically, I think it's possible to reconcile by saying Gam Zeh V'Zeh. Like the Baal Shem Tov, and more importantly, his disciples and followers were populists. That means that they reached the elites, but they also reached and gave immediacy to the masses. So they make themselves available. They make themselves more accessible. Miracle working was part of it, but even in sermons, you'll see sort of a two-track approach. My favorite Hasidic book is the Kedushat Levi, for example, and often the drashot, the sermons in there, seem to be speaking on two levels. You know, that's the genius, is to be able to say something profound for the scholars in your midst, and also something that will be meaningful and actually comprehensible to people who are less educated, maybe even uneducated. And I guess I tried to accomplish that in my own talk too. Everything in Hasidism seems to be in that spirit, and that is, Ora Wiskin actually writes about this too in her book, that ability to sort of speak to multiple audiences. But at the end of the day, we can't consider this egalitarianism because a hierarchy does exist, not least with the Rebbe and his family, but also there's a circle of disciples, and there's a reward for becoming a Talmid Chacham, for becoming a scholarly or mystical adept. There's a reward for that, access, status, and so on. But it doesn't preclude connection and really elevation of common working people, and that what was so successful and important about the movement.
Thank you so much. This is sort of blending with what the gentleman just said, and I'm just wondering about the we understand about neurodiversity and how people not only process information, but communicate. And I was very struck by that, how we communicate as part of being the way that we bring about Mashiach. So thank you. I'm just wondering if there's any work on that.
So the question is if there's direct discussion of neurodiversity within Hasidic, right?
Different ability to communicate as the so-called.
Right. So I think as Glenn was just saying in his comment, communication to an array of different individuals is one of the hallmarks of Hasidic teaching from the outset. In fact, one of the important early testimonies about the first Hasidic court, which is the court of the Maggid of Mezrich, the teacher of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi and of the Kedushas Levi, is a testimony by Solomon Maimon, who wrote an autobiography. He was a young scholar wandering around Eastern Europe who eventually ended up in Berlin in the circle of Mendelssohn, acquired some renown as a critic of the philosopher Immanuel Kant. And in his autobiography, he describes the court of the Maggid. And one of the things that especially impressed him and almost kind of drew him into the circle initially before he became disillusioned is that the Maggid took a bunch of different verses, collected verses from his audience, and then wove them together into a single teaching, and each individual around his table felt that the part of the teaching that dealt with their contribution addressed their particular problems, right? So there's a clear a legacy which is emphasized in all kinds of different ways by different perpetuators of the Hasidic movement and its different streams. There's this legacy of communication to the individual, speaking to the individual while also speaking to the community as a whole. So, and I would just add one more thing, which is that we have a much earlier principle, which goes back to Talmudic discussions, Ein Deisehem Shavas. People's minds are not the same. No one understands the same idea the same way as somebody else. Every iteration of understanding is a new iteration. And so that actually connects to the last thing I was pointing to with Rashab's idea about innovation. In a way, the innovation is something that's inescapable. Because we are all different, we are all always innovating. Any understanding that you have, if you've put a little bit of work into it, if you've invested, if you're drawing on your own experience to understand it, you are understanding it in a new way.
I want to push back a little bit against one of your provocative statements, Glenn, by way of asking the two of you whether two of you would agree that, taken as a whole, what Eli said kind of qualifies what you said in the beginning, in the sense that you made the argument that you don't think that Hasidus, that contrary to what popular belief, Hasidus was not as revolutionary as people like to think. And I wonder, like, because the examples you gave are mostly material and cultural and societal, but I wonder when it comes to intellectual, theology or traditional theology, I would argue that Hasidus was quite revolutionary, not just in its dissemination, but also I think if you kind of break down the examples that Ali gave, wouldn't you say that the way they understand these concepts, and it might be that there's precedent, but I would argue that their presentation was quite revolutionary and quite controversial in their time. And I'm wondering if either of you agree or disagree.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, and the first thing I said, the first superlative was this was the most important spiritual revolution since the appearance of Kabbalah in the Middle Ages. So I said spiritual, intellectual, right? I consider them so. What I want to be careful about, though, is when we say revolutionary in a social sense, that there was some sort of a social upheaval that occurred. Look, there was, I would say, increased accessibility. It was very difficult to access a Talmudic scholar or a posek in pre-Hasidic East European Jewish society, and now suddenly you can actually go face-to-face encounter with a gadol, with a spiritual adept. That is an important innovation there. But any talk about democratic, spiritual, socialist type of Hasidic society, I think, is definitely anachronistic. We just have to be clear what we mean when we say revolutionary. But I would definitely agree with what you just said. So intellectually, yeah. I try. So right. So I tried to show also how intellectually you do have a kind of a revolution here. It's very loose interpretations of psukim, of biblical verses, even shocking, for somebody. And often I find in Washington, D.C., my new community, when I try to give a Hasidic drash at the table, everybody's arguing with me because it's not literally making sense to them. How can you interpret this verse in this manner? I mean, these people have no imagination. Come on. But I think the point is, yes, there's a very, very groundbreaking creative relationship to interpretation of biblical verses, what we would call hermeneutics or exegetical kind of approaches that is absolutely revolutionary. I would agree with that.